At the site of ancient Jericho, a city famously besieged and destroyed by the Israelite army according to the book of Joshua, archaeological excavations reveal virtually no evidence of a major city or fortifications standing during the Late Bronze Age, precisely when the biblical narrative places its dramatic fall. This immediate discrepancy confronts us with a profound challenge. What do we do when the stones beneath our feet seem to tell a different story than the ancient texts we hold so sacred? For generations, the vivid account of the Israelite conquest of Canaan, culminating in the miraculous collapse of Jericho's walls and the systematic destruction of cities like Ai and Hazor, has stood as a cornerstone of faith and national identity. It paints a picture of a unified people, led by divine command, sweeping into a promised land. But when modern archaeology began to systematically unearth the layers of these ancient sites, a very different picture started to emerge. The stakes here are immense. If the Exodus and Conquest are not historical events as described, what does that mean for the historicity of the entire Hebrew Bible, and by extension, for the very foundations of the Israelite people? This is the central question we grapple with today. Did the Israelite conquest, as recounted in the book of Joshua, truly happen? And what does the soil, the shards, and the structures left behind actually reveal? Before we dig deeper into the dust of ancient cities and the painstaking work of archaeologists, I'm curious, what version of this story, the marching armies, the falling walls, did you grow up hearing? Was it presented as absolute historical fact, a powerful allegory, or perhaps something in between? Let me know in your comments below. It helps us understand the different perspectives people bring to this ancient narrative. Let's begin with the biblical account itself. The book of Joshua opens with a nation poised on the brink of Canaan, ready to fulfill a divine promise. After crossing the Jordan River, their first target is Jericho, a heavily fortified city. The narrative details a ritualistic circumambulation for 7 days, culminating in a mighty shout that brings down the walls, allowing the Israelites to storm the city, annihilating its inhabitants and setting it ablaze. Jericho is presented not just as a strategic victory, but as a demonstration of divine power and Israelite obedience. The text describes a total destruction, a city cursed, never to be rebuilt. This is the story, clear and dramatic, that has echoed through millennia. Now consider the archaeological record at Tel es-Sultan, the mound of ancient Jericho. Early excavators like John Garstang in the 1930s believed they found evidence of a massive collapse and burning around the time of Joshua, suggesting a powerful confirmation of the biblical account. He spoke of walls that had truly fallen, precisely as the Bible described. This was a comforting congruence for many, a physical testament to a foundational story. But then, a more rigorous and systematic excavation began in the 1950s, led by the formidable British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon. Her methods were revolutionary for their time, focused on precise stratigraphy, the careful analysis of soil layers to establish chronology. What Kenyon found profoundly reshaped the understanding of Jericho. While she identified fortifications from the early Bronze Age and even the Middle Bronze Age that had indeed collapsed, these predated the associated Israelite conquest by hundreds, if not 1,000 years. Crucially, for the Late Bronze Age, the period roughly 1550 to 1200 BCE, during which most scholars place the Exodus and Conquest, Kenyon found something startling: almost no trace of a major walled city. Instead, what she uncovered were scattered remains, indicating a small, unwalled settlement, if anything substantial at all. There was no great defensive wall to fall, no widespread destruction layer from this period. Her conclusion was stark. The Jericho of Joshua's time was simply not there to be conquered in the dramatic fashion described. This discovery sent shockwaves through biblical scholarship. How could such a pivotal event, so richly detailed, leave no discernible trace on the very ground it supposedly happened? This wasn't just a minor discrepancy, it was a fundamental challenge to a literal reading of the text. Some scholars, like Bryant G. Wood, later revisited Kenyon's findings, arguing for a slightly earlier dating of a destruction layer that could align with the biblical narrative, emphasizing pottery analysis. However, the overwhelming consensus among archaeologists remains that late Bronze Age Jericho was, at best, an insignificant village, if not entirely uninhabited during the period traditionally assigned to the Israelite conquest. This divergence forces a choice. Either the biblical chronology is significantly off, or the narrative should not be read as a literal historical blueprint. Leaving Jericho, the biblical narrative next describes the conquest of Ai, another strategically important city. The book of Joshua presents a detailed account of its capture, an initial Israelite defeat followed by an elaborate ambush strategy, leading to the city's total destruction by fire and the hanging of its king. The name Ai itself means the ruin, which might seem to lend credence to the idea of its ancient devastation. The text explicitly states that Ai was reduced to a permanent heap of ruins. It's another powerful story of divine guidance and military prowess. Archaeology, however, presents an even more pronounced problem at Ai than at Jericho. The most likely candidate for biblical Ai is generally identified as Et Tel, a prominent mound in the central Benjamin region. Excavations at Et Tel, however, consistently demonstrate that this site was a thriving city during the early Bronze Age, roughly 3100–2400 BCE, possessing impressive fortifications and a large population. But following its destruction around 2400 BCE, it remained largely uninhabited for over 1,000 years. There was no city at Et Tel during the late Bronze Age for the Israelites to conquer. Just like Jericho, the city wasn't there. This consistent archaeological silence at key sites like Jericho and Ai became a major pillar for what is known as the minimalist school of thought in biblical archaeology. If these central named cities were not occupied or were mere villages during the period of the supposed conquest, then the entire narrative of a rapid, widespread military takeover of Canaan by a unified Israelite force becomes deeply problematic. The absence of evidence here is not simply frustrating, it actively contradicts the explicit claims of the text regarding urban centers and significant military engagements. How could such intricate military maneuvers and devastating battles have occurred in places that were, by all archaeological indications, nothing more than dust and uninhabited mounds? This raises a profound question about the very nature of the book of Joshua's historical claims. Yet not all sites present such a straightforward contradiction. The book of Joshua also describes the conquest of Hazor, a major Canaanite city in the northern Galilee. Unlike Jericho and Ai, Hazor is depicted as the head of all those kingdoms, a truly powerful and influential urban center. The biblical text describes Joshua utterly destroying Hazor by fire, slaughtering its inhabitants, and leaving it as a permanent ruin, much like Ai. This destruction is presented as a particularly significant achievement, marking the end of a formidable enemy. At Tel Hazor, the archaeological picture is dramatically different and more complex.
Excavations have revealed a truly massive and important city, one of the largest in the ancient Near East, with a rich history spanning millennia. Crucially, archaeologists have indeed uncovered a massive destruction layer at Hazor, unequivocally dated to the late Bronze Age, precisely the period when the biblical conquest would have occurred. This layer shows widespread burning, shattered pottery, and collapsed structures, indicating a violent and catastrophic end for the late Bronze Age city. This evidence seems, at first glance, to perfectly align with the biblical description. Here, finally, was archaeological confirmation of a major conquest event. However, the question then becomes, who was responsible for this destruction? While the biblical text attributes it to the Israelites under Joshua, the archaeological evidence at Hazor doesn't definitively point to them. The material culture, the types of pottery, weapons, and tools found in the destruction layer doesn't exclusively suggest an Israelite identity for the destroyers. Furthermore, other destructive events by various groups, such as the Sea Peoples or even internal Canaanite conflicts, are known to have occurred in the region during this tumultuous period. So, while Hazor certainly experienced a devastating destruction consistent with the biblical timeline, confidently attributing it to Joshua's army based solely on archaeological finds remains an interpretive leap, not a conclusive proof. It's a tantalizing piece of the puzzle, yet it doesn't quite complete the picture in the way a simple confirmation might. Beyond these specific cities, what about the broader archaeological landscape of Canaan during the Late Bronze Age and the Early Iron Age, the period spanning the supposed conquest and the early Israelite settlement? The biblical narrative suggests a widespread campaign of destruction and displacement, with many cities being razed to the ground. If this were truly the case, we would expect to see a consistent pattern of widespread destruction layers across numerous Canaanite sites, followed by the emergence of new, distinctly Israelite settlements. What does the ground show us? The general archaeological consensus points to a more nuanced reality. While there were indeed destructions at some sites, like Hazor, they were not uniformly widespread across Canaan. Many Canaanite cities simply show a gradual decline or continued occupation, rather than violent overthrow. More strikingly, the emergence of early Israelite settlements in the central hill country, the highlands of Judah and Ephraim, doesn't typically appear as a result of conquering existing cities. Instead, we see the rise of hundreds of small, unwalled villages in previously sparsely populated areas. These are new settlements, often built on virgin soil, rather than on the ashes of destroyed Canaanite towns. This pattern fundamentally challenges the depiction of a swift, unified military conquest driving out and replacing existing urban populations. This is where the emergence model, or settlement model of Israelite origins gains significant traction among scholars. Instead of an external invasion, this model proposes that early Israel largely developed internally within Canaan. It suggests that various groups, perhaps semi-nomadic pastoralists, disaffected Canaanite peasants, or even segments of the existing Canaanite population, began to settle in the Central Highlands, gradually developing a distinct identity that would eventually coalesce into Israel. They didn't conquer cities, they built new communities in the less desirable, less populated hill country. This model finds support in the archaeological record, which reveals a distinct material culture in these early highland settlements, offering clues about their way of life. What are these clues? These early Israelite settlements, dating to the early Iron Age, roughly 1200 to 1000 BCE, exhibit several characteristic features.
We find what archaeologists call four-room houses, a distinctive architectural style consisting of a broad room with three long rooms radiating from it, often interpreted as communal dwellings. The pottery found is relatively simple, suggesting a self-sufficient agricultural economy. Perhaps one of the most compelling pieces of evidence, though often debated, is the consistent absence of pig bones in these early Israelite sites. In contrast, pig bones are frequently found in contemporary Canaanite and Philistine sites. While not proof of an exclusive diet, this difference hints at a developing cultural distinction, perhaps related to early dietary laws or taboos. These patterns point towards a gradual, internal development rather than a sudden external imposition. The picture painted by archaeology is therefore not one of a dramatic, unified military campaign, but rather of a more complex, gradual process of settlement and identity formation. This doesn't necessarily invalidate the spiritual or theological message of the conquest narrative, but it certainly calls into question its literal historicity as a military event. It forces us to ask, if the archaeological evidence doesn't support a direct, literal reading of the book of Joshua, what was the purpose of this powerful narrative, and how did it come to be? This leads us to consider the nature of ancient historiography and how it differs from our modern expectations of history. Adding another layer of complexity to this discussion is one of the most significant extra-biblical finds related to early Israel, the Merneptah stele. This ancient Egyptian inscription, dating to around 1208 BCE, commemorates the military campaigns of Pharaoh Merneptah in Canaan. Among a list of defeated peoples and places, it famously contains the line, "Israel is laid waste, its seed is not." This is the earliest known non-biblical reference to Israel, and it places a distinct entity called Israel in Canaan during the Late Bronze Age, specifically around the time archaeologists see the early highland settlements emerging. The Merneptah stele is a crucial piece of evidence because it demonstrates that Israel existed as an identifiable group in Canaan long before any widespread military conquest described in Joshua could have occurred, at least in its traditional dating. It suggests that Israel was already established, perhaps as a tribal entity or a collection of settled groups, rather than an invading force just beginning its entry into the land. This discovery further complicates the idea of a sudden, sweeping conquest, instead hinting at a more prolonged and integrated presence within the region. It also indicates that Israel was significant enough to be mentioned by a powerful Egyptian pharaoh, even if only as a defeated people. This independent confirmation of Israel's early existence is invaluable, even if it doesn't endorse the conquest narrative. So, how do scholars navigate these often conflicting streams of evidence, the compelling biblical narrative, the often silent or contradictory archaeological record, and the occasional external attestation? There are broadly three main approaches: maximalist, minimalist, and centrist. Maximalists tend to prioritize the biblical text, seeking to interpret archaeological findings in ways that harmonize with it, often pushing for alternative chronologies or explanations for missing evidence. They might argue that archaeological methods are limited, or that the biblical accounts describe smaller-scale events amplified in tradition. Minimalists, on the other hand, tend to approach the biblical text with extreme skepticism, often viewing it primarily as a theological or ideological construct from a much later period, bearing little direct historical relation to the events it purports to describe.
They emphasize the archaeological absences and contradictions, often suggesting that narratives like the conquest are etiological tales designed to explain existing ruins or to forge a sense of national identity. For them, the archaeological record is the primary authority, and the biblical text must conform to it or be reinterpreted as non-historical. The centrist position, which encompasses a broad range of scholarly views, attempts to find a middle ground. These scholars acknowledge the significant discrepancies between the biblical account of the conquest and the archaeological evidence, particularly regarding specific cities and a unified military campaign. However, they also recognize that the Bible often contains kernels of historical memory, albeit filtered through centuries of retelling, theological interpretation, and literary shaping. They might suggest that a conquest occurred, but perhaps as a series of smaller, localized infiltrations, migrations, or internal rebellions, rather than a grand unified invasion. They seek to understand the purpose and context of the biblical narrative within its ancient literary traditions, rather than simply dismissing it or forcing it into a literal historical mold. They ask what the story meant to its original audience, not just if it happened exactly as described. This perspective often leads to a reevaluation of the book of Joshua itself. Could it be an epic foundation story, designed to unify a disparate people and provide a powerful narrative of divine providence rather than a literal military chronicle? Ancient epic narratives often blend historical memory with legendary elements, hero stories, and theological messages. The purpose of such texts wasn't necessarily to record every detail with modern journalistic accuracy, but to convey profound truths about identity, purpose, and relationship with the divine. The conquest narrative, viewed through this lens, becomes less about the precise number of cities destroyed and more about the ideological construction of a promised land and a chosen people. Consider, for example, the nature of memory and tradition in pre-literate or semi-literate societies. Stories are passed down orally for generations, shaped and refined, often acquiring symbolic weight. Historical figures might become archetypes. Specific events might be conflated or condensed. The story of a gradual settlement of disparate groups in the highlands facing challenges from existing populations could, over centuries, transform into the epic narrative of a unified army sweeping away all opposition under a divinely appointed leader. This doesn't diminish the story's power or its importance to those who cherish it, it simply reframes our understanding of its historical claim. The scholarship points to a significant gap between the vivid, detailed narrative of a unified, divinely orchestrated conquest and the archaeological evidence that points to a much more gradual, less violent, and largely internal emergence of Israel in Canaan. We can say with confidence that archaeology does not support the biblical account of a swift, destructive conquest by an invading Israelite army across all of Canaan during the Late Bronze Age. Key cities like Jericho and Ai show no evidence of being populated, let alone destroyed, during this period. The overall pattern suggests settlement in the highlands rather than widespread overthrow of existing urban centers. What we can say with confidence is that Israel existed as an identifiable entity in Canaan by the late 13th century BCE, as attested by the Mernechta stele. We also see the archaeological signature of distinct early Israelite settlements emerging in the Central Hill Country during the early Iron Age. These settlements feature unique architectural styles, pottery, and dietary patterns that differentiate them from their Canaanite neighbors.
This points to a process of identity formation and consolidation within the land itself, rather than solely through external invasion. What we cannot say with confidence is that the book of Joshua is entirely devoid of historical memory. It's plausible that some localized conflicts or movements of people occurred, which were later woven into a grander, more unified narrative. The destruction of Hazor is a reminder that some biblical claims do have archaeological counterparts, even if the precise agents of destruction remain debated. The tension lies in reconciling a compelling, foundational story with a complex, often ambiguous archaeological record. Ultimately, the archaeological answer to "Did the Israelite conquest happen as described?" is a nuanced no. It challenges a literal interpretation of the book of Joshua as a detailed historical chronicle of military campaigns. However, this does not mean that the story holds no truth. It means we must engage with the biblical text not just as history in the modern sense, but as sacred history, as literature, and as a powerful narrative that shaped a people's understanding of their origins and their covenant with God. The shocking answer from archaeology doesn't destroy the narrative. It deepens our understanding of its complexity, forcing us to explore the profound difference between the history etched in texts and the history uncovered in the earth. It compels us to ask what kind of truth an ancient text intends to convey, inviting a richer, more thoughtful engagement with both faith and the past.